lesson this morning comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 62, verses 1 through 5. It can be found on page 641 of your pew Bibles. It's not often that all of our lessons have a common theme running through them, but that certainly is the case with the two we're reading this morning, as both of them make reference to a wedding. In this lesson, we're reading the prophet likens the new relationship that Israel is going to have with God now that they have returned from their time in exile to that of a new relationship, of a wedding. It's sort of a common image, actually, that occurs throughout the Old Testament, that of likening God's relationship with humanity as that of a wedding. This is a little unclear, though, in this text who is speaking. That's the problem with this. We don't know if it's the prophet. We don't know if it's the prophet speaking God's words. We don't know if it's a little bit of both of them. But nonetheless, certainly some hopeful words here for the people of Israel. And we'll read here in the 62nd chapter. For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory. And you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, My delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. And our gospel lesson is from John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, found on page 923. So after spending a fair amount of time in Luke's gospel over these past few weeks, we are jumping over to John's gospel in order to hear the first miracle, or the first sign, as John calls it, of Jesus' ministry, and that is turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana. This is a miracle that's only found in John's gospel. John is the latest gospel that was written, and thus the most theologized gospel, if you will. He was less concerned with presenting the story of Jesus than he was with trying to present the theology of who Jesus was and what Jesus was. And so the fact that John puts this as really the first action of Jesus' ministry is significant, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We'll read here in the 2nd chapter. On the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, They have no wine. And Jesus said to her, Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, Do whatever he tells you. Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, Fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. May God's blessing be upon the hearing and the understanding of this holy word. As I'm sure you all know, this past week marked the 1-month anniversary of the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. This afternoon, the New England Patriots and other NFL players will once again be wearing stickers on their helmets to remember what happened. But the reality is, as we as a society are so good at doing, we have really turned our attention away from Newtown to other things, not the least of which being an important gun control debate. And it's because our attention has shifted that it was hard, at least for me, to see those cameras panning back and forth across the outside of the school again this week, and to see those children's faces and to hear the parents speaking and eulogizing their children once again. And yet it was in the midst of all of this difficult remembering this week that a piece to the story that I hadn't heard before emerged. In a classroom of 16 students, apparently one 6-year-old girl made it out alive. Wanting to remain unidentified, which is likely why this story has somewhat flown under the radar, this young girl said that she saw the shooter come in, described him as someone who she felt was angry and someone who she felt was very mad, and then had the presence of mind to lie on the floor alongside her classmates and play dead. When it was over, The young girl ran out of the school covered in blood, and the first thing she said was, "Mommy, I'm okay, but all of my friends are dead." Her pastor, Jim Solomon, was quoted afterwards as saying that her survival was because of God's grace, further elaborating to say, "I think her survival was impossible outside of divine intervention." Likely it's for this reason that the story ran under the headline, "Miracle of 6-year-old Lone Survivor in Newtown Classroom." A miracle. It's what we hear after every tragedy or natural disaster or horrendous happening, isn't it? The September 11th attacks, the earthquake in Haiti, Superstorm Sandy, the recent flooding and tornadoes that hit the middle of the country. One child survives, a lone house is not blown to the ground, someone who was supposed to go to work that day called in sick. Something amazing happens and we are quick to label it a miracle. And such occurrences give us reason to celebrate amid some awfully hard times, it's true, but we don't stay there. For it doesn't take long for that conversation to shift. Well, if God saved one child in Newtown, then why didn't God save all of the children? Or why didn't God stop that earthquake from happening in the first place? Or why would God pick one child to save and not the others? If God was all loving, wouldn't God want to save all of the children? Hard questions to ask and even harder questions to answer. So does John's Gospel have any light to shed on this, you may be wondering? Well, let's turn to that lesson and we'll see what we can figure out. So the wedding in Cana, or more aptly described, the site of Jesus' first miracle or sign as termed in the Gospel of John. Now, I don't know what you're thinking, but I have to say it's a pretty strange way to begin a gospel, given that this story almost has a comedic element to it, with this being the very first time that John shows Jesus in action. So let's set the scene this morning. Jesus, his mother, and the disciples have been invited to a wedding. You can almost envisioning them sitting there listening to some music, Jesus tapping his foot, the disciples daring each other to be the first one out on the dance floor or to approach a pretty girl, when Jesus' mother says, "They've run out of wine." If this were a movie at this point, the music would screech to a stop and all of the eyes at the table would focus on Jesus' mother. "What?" they'd all say to her. So what's the big deal, you're probably wondering. Wouldn't it just mean that the party would break up a little bit sooner than usual? Yes. But the problem is, in those days, the bride and groom celebrated the marriage not with a honeymoon, but with a 7-day wedding feast at the groom's home, and this was only day 3. Running out of wine, then, constitutes a crisis for the family who shoulders the responsibility of hospitality. For if you run out of wine at your wedding, then you start your married life in shame. You can actually be shunned for your entire married life. Needless to say, then, this could be a problem for this couple. So Jesus' mother turns to Jesus and says, "Do something, would you?" To which Jesus responds, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me?" Now his words actually sound a lot harsher to us in English than they probably sounded back then, because the expression was more a formula of disengagement than it was one of rudeness. A better translation might have been something like, "Really, is that any of our business, mother, yours or mine? This isn't my time, don't push me." Parents, sound familiar to conversations you've had with your kids, I'm sure. So what does Mary do next? She tells the servants to do whatever Jesus tells them to do. In other words, she gives Jesus no choice but to act. And act he does, instructing them to fill up the stone jars with water, each holding some 20 or 30 gallons to the brim, and then he promptly turns them into wine. But this is not the cheap box stuff, we're told. This is the good stuff. Now at this point, the theologians begin to swoop in like vultures trying to find symbolic meaning in the text. Could it be that Jesus is saying that he's the new wine, superior to the old wine that the Jews had been drinking? Since this sign happens on the 3rd day, is that a prelude to Jesus' resurrection on the 3rd day? Since 7 is the biblical number of completion or fullness, and Jesus only fills up 6 jars, is he saying that there's more work to be done in the world? Does this wedding represent the beginning of a new age in Jewish history? Lots of interpretations, such as these, have been written. Some good, some perhaps a little bit more of a stretch. But regardless, I'm not really sure that digging deeply into this text is where we need to go today. Rather, we should resist the temptation, I think, to try and find symbolism in every single little detail. Save that for the theologians to debate over, or for a cure for your insomnia someday. Instead, I'd rather us take this story at face value this morning. And in so doing, what we need to say then is that this is not a miracle that permits any blind person to see, does not restore an ailing child to their parents, doesn't rescue anyone who is imperiled by a storm. It really seems more of a luxury than a need. More wine for a wedding? It would have been a disgrace to run out of wine for sure, but shouldn't Jesus be worrying about bigger things than this? Maybe. But the fact of the matter is, John, in his overly theologized, carefully crafted gospel, saw enough in this story to make this Jesus' first action that he undertakes in his gospel. So it's got to be here for a reason, right? Well, I think it is. Because I think that this shows us a God who says yes to gladness and joy. I think it shows us a God who offers us unimaginable generosity and sheer abundance. I think it shows us a God who is willing to shower us with extravagant blessings more than we could ever expect. I think it shows us a God who is living and moving and active in the world, even and especially when nobody notices. Because did you happen to notice that nobody really suspects what Jesus has done? No one says, wow, some miracle worker must have changed these vats of water into wine. No, the steward just says, are you crazy? Why would you save the good stuff until the end? In other words, this is a miracle to bring some joy at a wedding. So ordinary that most all of the people who were there wouldn't have noticed that anything happened. The disciples and the servants are said to take notice, perhaps because they had different eyes on than others, but pretty much nobody else has a clue. That makes this a miracle just because. And that leads me to wonder, is that what John is trying to get across with this story? Is he making the point that God is active in the world just because, in ways that we just fail to often notice? It may well be. And I think that's because we may well misunderstand what a miracle is. We think a miracle has to be God swooping down and turning 5 loaves and 2 fish into a feast to feed the masses, or God stilling a violent storm on the water, or God curing cancer with a word. But this says something different. This suggests that a miracle is simply a window through which God is revealed. Or even more simply than that, a miracle is a sign that points to God. And we have those signs everywhere, don't we? Now, we don't mean finding a parking space on a crowded Boston street, or sorry, the Ravens missing the field goal last year. Not miracles, sorry. But I would argue that a beautiful winter storm that coats the trees and ground in a fresh blanket of white is, as is a young child finding her legs under the overly cautious gaze of her parents. A friend reaching out to hold another when tragedy hits and no words can be expressed. The first flower poking through the ground to bloom after a long, cold winter. A community coming together to care for one of their own going through a difficult time. A rainbow arching across the sky after a particularly vicious rainstorm. A teacher staying late after school to make sure that her student not only passes the test but truly understands the material. A firefighter willing to brave a burning building in hopes of saving someone that he's never met before. A young preacher from Montgomery, Alabama, organizing an historic movement that would change the world as we know it. A 6-year-old girl with enough wherewithal to lie still and save her own life. Andrew's head, Noah's toenails. These are miracles. These are moments that direct our attention to God, and that makes them miraculous in my eyes. And as such, it leads me to wonder whether it's time for us to adopt some new lenses with which to see the world. For instead of seeing something miraculous and saying, well, that's great, but geez, why isn't God doing this? And why isn't God doing that? And why isn't God working over here? Why not allow such a sight to shift our gaze to where God is already working? Perhaps even, dare we say, to make what could be an even worse situation a little less awful, that we just didn't see. The elderly man who welcomed 6 children running from Sandy Hook Elementary into his home to keep them safe. The first responders who knew enough to tell the children to cover their eyes so they wouldn't see anything on the way out. The teachers who read stories to children huddled in classrooms so that they wouldn't think that anything unusual was happening. An African-American woman, unwilling to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. Thousands willing to risk their lives to march for basic human rights. Miracles? Maybe yes. Maybe no. It all depends on whether your eyes believe that miracles are happening or not. It's up to you what lenses you put on. But I have to say that seeing a pretty amazing God doing some pretty amazing things out there is a pretty amazing way to view the world. It might just be enough to bring a pretty miraculous change to your life. Amen. Our final hymn this morning is 593 in your